Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about issues that impact social justice locally and globally. Today, we have with us Professor Tahseen Shams. Professor Tahseen Shams is Assistant Professor of Sociology and the Basil Hyde Research, I'm butchering the name, apologies for that, Basil Hyde Research Fellow of the Center for the Study of the United States and the University at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD from University of California, Los Angeles in 2018. Using a range of qualitative methods, her book and other sole author peer-reviewed research publications answers how transnational global forms of inequality intersect with local forms of boundary work to affect immigrant groups, particularly those coming from Muslim-majority developing countries to the West. Her book, Here, There, and Elsewhere, The Making of Immigrant Identities in a Globalized World, published by Stanford University, on South Asian Muslim immigrants, is the recipient of the prestigious 2021 Distinguished Scholarship Award given by Pacific Sociological Association to the most important sociological scholarship of the preceding year. And Professor Shams also received the award very recently. Congratulations, Professor Shams, winner of the 2021 Thomas and Zinaneki Book Award by in the International Migration section of the American Sociological Association. Professor Shams also has been awarded an honorable mention for the best article from the Global and Transnational Sociology section of the American Sociological Association. Her work have been adopted as required text in over a dozen courses in Canadian and US universities. And she has been invited to present in over 20 university venues in Canada and US, Europe, Middle East, and North of Africa. Her research has been awarded over $300,000 through various competitive grants and has been featured in both media and policy sectors. Very outstanding academic career, stellar track record. And we have with us Dr. Sangeeta Roy. Dr. Sangeeta has written a book review of Dr. Shams's book. So both of you, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Feroz. The pleasure is all mine. And when you first invited me and told me about the Canada Bangladesh Social Justice and Action Research Alliance, I couldn't help but admire what you were doing. So it's an honor to be here. I am looking forward to discussing the book and also learning from Sangeeta and you. So, and also thank you for that very generous introduction.
Thank you, Professor Shams. Welcome, Sangeeta.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
So what I was wondering that today's format of conversation could be, we could ask Professor Shams to give us a bit of the context of writing the book. What are some of the things that were going, in her thinking process, how her own subjectivity, her own lived experiences have been connected to it. And after we hear it from Professor Shams, and then, Sangeeta could discuss and then ask probably a few follow-up questions. And today what I also want to do is that as a Bengali Muslim immigrant myself and having had some bit of lived experience and also a bit of theoretical training, wanted to engage in conversation. As we always start the conversation by saying is that we use these conversations to promote critical consciousness for Bangladeshi students. So towards the end, I'll also ask a few questions in Bangla so that we can make the conversation more engaging. So with that, Professor Shams, if you could proceed.
Thank you so much again, Feroz. Today I'll be presenting briefly about my book, Here, There, and Elsewhere, The Making of Immigrant Identities in a Globalized World. And related to that is also some of the questions about positionality and subjectivity that you just mentioned. My book is about how, contrary to common perception, immigrants' identities are shaped by geopolitics, not just in the immigrant sending and receiving countries, but also in those places located beyond the homeland and hostland, places I conceptualize as elsewhere. Based on ethnographic data, in-depth interviews, and analysis of social media activities of South Asian Muslim Americans, I introduced a new analytical model for studying immigrant identity formation, the multi-centered relational framework, which can encompass global geopolitics in the immigrants' homeland, hostland, and elsewhere. The book is rooted in my personal story as much as it is embedded in my curiosity as a migration scholar. I am a first generation Bangladeshi immigrant who arrived in the United States with her family as a teenager. My first introduction to the US was in Mississippi, specifically Hattiesburg, a small, predominantly white conservative college town where my parents still live. I was recuperating at my parents' place from a particularly tough, grueling quarter of graduate school at UCLA when the 2015 Charlie Hebdo attacks took place in Paris. It was, of course, a horrific event, but I also remember my parents being glued to their TV as they followed the live coverage. Although the attacks had happened far away in France and elsewhere that is neither Bangladesh, where they're from, nor the United States, which they now call home, they still feared a backlash in their small town. They called a handful of other Bangladeshi Muslims they knew in the area and learned that they too feared a backlash. One of them was a hijabi woman who was studying to become a doctor. And I remember that she had decided not to go to the local library the next day to study. Later that year, I was back in LA, but that was when ISIS had attacked Paris. And there too, I saw the same kinds of fears among the South Asian Muslims I was studying, despite the significantly more cosmopolitan milieu in Los Angeles. A common frame of reference that hung over everyone in these communities was 9/11, as if the ISIS attacks had happened not far away in France, but here in America. Yes, immigrants do have various global connections that transcend homeland-homeland borders. But then how do these places beyond, but in relation to the homeland and hostland, also shape immigrants' identities? I could not find an answer to this question in the foundational readings on international migration, which focused largely on the sending and receiving countries. Let's take a look at these foundational ways of thinking. Assimilation theories analyze how hostland contexts shape immigrants' homeland identities over time. Transnationalism expands the focus beyond the hostland, but is still bound within the dyadic homeland-hostland paradigm. And diaspora shows how members of a dispersed population are linked to a common homeland and to each other, but largely overlooks the hostland context. My book extends the migration scholarship by showing how places beyond the homeland and hostland, elsewhere, shape how immigrants view themselves, that is, their self-identification with elsewhere, and how these places shape how others in the hostland view these immigrants, that is, identification of immigrants by others in relation to elsewhere. Using data on South Asian Muslim Americans, I show that different dimensions of the immigrants' Muslim identity category connect them to different elsewhere contexts. As Muslims, these immigrants, as we know, are members of the Ummah, which is the imagined worldwide community of Muslims that subsumes borders and connects all Muslims, reproducing shared beliefs, practices, and a sense of membership. But the heartland of this imagined community is not necessarily found in South Asia, but in the Middle East. As the birthplace of Prophet Muhammad and the location of Islam's holiest sites, the Middle East is arguably the religious and political center of the Muslim world. And as self-identifying Muslims, these immigrants subscribe to the various places, peoples, histories, and conflicts in the Middle East that sustain their Muslim identities. As such, many of my participants were politically oriented towards elsewhere Middle Eastern places, such as Palestine, Syria, and Turkey. However, how the participants self-identified did not determine how they were identified by others in the hostland. Despite the salience of the Middle East in the participants' self-identification, it was the Muslim-related context in Europe that shaped how Muslims at large were perceived in America. For example, whereas the 2015 ISIS attacks in Paris that I mentioned produced Islamophobic backlash in the US, similar attacks in Beirut just one day before the Paris attacks had gone virtually unnoticed. So in these examples, the multi-centered relational framework captures three specific points of focus or centers, thereby expanding the homeland-hostland dyad. First, we have the immigrants' homelands, in this case, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. Second, we have the hostland, the United States. And third, we have elsewhere, the Middle East and Europe. The main goal of this multi-centered relational framework is to capture if, how, and when the relationships between which centers become salient and shape the immigrant's worldview and day-to-day interactions. But I must mention that elsewhere does not mean everywhere. A place located beyond the homeland and hostland by itself is not important to the immigrants' identities. It is only when that place is salient to the homeland society, the hostland society, or the relationship between the two that the place becomes an elsewhere. In other words, elsewhere is a place that is meaningful for not just the immigrants, but also for the people around them, which is why elsewhere affects how immigrants understand their location in both global and hostland social hierarchies. I argue that a place is an elsewhere if the answer is yes to the following questions. Are the contexts in a place beyond the homeland and hostland relevant to the immigrant's sense of self? Do those contexts shape how others in the hostland view these immigrants in their day-to-day lives? Here, There, and Elsewhere presents my findings to these questions, as well as the conditions, the parameters, generalizability of the Elsewhere framework. I will give a couple of examples from my book to just show how this may look like in everyday life. To give the first example, almost 50% of Nigeria's population is Muslim. But when I did fieldwork, my participants neither knew nor cared much about that country because it was mostly irrelevant to their daily lives. But Nigeria became relevant to their sense of selves because of Boko Haram, the Islamist terrorist group active in Nigeria, and its connections to ISIS. Boko Haram came into public attention when Michelle Obama had publicized a campaign to bring back 300 Nigerian schoolgirls who were kidnapped by these militants. To many participants, such as Zinat, who was a hijabi Bangladeshi woman, Boko Haram gave Islam and Muslims a bad name and shaped how Muslims as a whole are perceived in America. Zinat did not know where Nigeria is exactly located, its shape on the world map, or its demographic profile. What she did know, based on American news channels and social media, was that Boko Haram is located inside that country, and understood that what it is still doing there may affect her here in America. What this example shows is that an irrelevant case can become relevant if events in that place draw the hostland's political and media attention in a way that make the participants' already stigmatized identity even more suspect. Another example I'll give is how my participants, regardless of the immigrant generation, evaluated mainstream US politicians based on the politicians' attitude towards Palestine, among other issues. For example, during the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination, most participants I interviewed favored Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton because they viewed Sanders as being more open and sympathetic towards Palestine than Clinton, whose Middle East policy they saw to be too pro-Israeli and thus biased against Muslims' interests. I analyzed why this may be the case using the multi-centered relational framework. What I found was, and what I argue is, that these immigrants come from homelands where the national, political, and religious lives are still very much influenced by their colonized past at the hands of the British. There are several religious political divisions, both within and between the South Asian homelands. With regard to Islam, there is Arab influence over Islam throughout South Asia overall, although I should mention that South Asian Islam has some unique characteristics of its own. And people generally are informed of the many instances of Western interventions in many parts of the Muslim world, such as Palestine, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and even Pakistan. The immigrants bring these homeland contexts with them when they immigrate to the United States. Upon arrival, they encounter the heightened Islamophobic atmosphere after 9/11. These Islamophobic encounters, combined with the shadow of their colonized past and the continuing contentious relationship between the US and the Middle East, reinforce these immigrants' view that the West is generally anti-Muslim. However, as Muslim Americans, they can now influence US policies towards the Muslim world by voting and engaging with mainstream politics, something that they were not able to do back in the homeland, despite having sympathies for their fellow Muslims. As such, the immigrants tend to favor mainstream politicians who they view to be more sympathetic to Muslims, both in the United States and in places abroad. This orientation towards the Middle East reveals a form of cross border tie that goes beyond what we know about immigrants' political engagements from abroad, which thus far we have known to be directed towards the homeland. But here, the South Asians are politically oriented towards elsewhere. Sometimes Muslim related issues in the Middle East even gained priority over what was happening in their homeland. For example, in late 2015, around the same time when the Syrian refugee crisis caught the world's attention, another refugee crisis was unfolding in South Asia, that of the Rohingya Muslims. Rohingyas, as we know, are a Muslim ethnic minority in the western Rakhine state of Myanmar. The Myanmar government views the Rohingya as illegal Bangladeshi immigrants, although these people have lived in Myanmar for centuries, fleeing violent persecution by the Myanmar government. Rohingyas have now sought asylum in neighboring countries, mainly Bangladesh, and many, as we know, still live in quite dire conditions. Although, unlike the Syrian refugee crisis, the Rohingya refugee crisis directly involves Bangladesh, I was surprised when I was doing fieldwork to learn that many Bangladeshis were unaware of even who the Rohingyas were. Whereas they avidly paid attention to the Syrian refugee crisis by reading news articles, discussing amongst themselves, liking and posting statuses on Facebook, donating and raising funds through their mosques, the Rohingya crisis went virtually unnoticed. So what is new about what I am saying? The multi-centered relational framework is different from the assimilation perspective in that it shows how exogenous shocks emanating from beyond the host land shape immigrants' identities. A disruption in the international order highlights the immigrants' foreignness as they are linked to an external threat, but now the threat is seen as internal, given that the immigrants' location is inside the host land territory. As such, immigrants are put under heightened suspicion as outsiders, highlighting their difference from the native hostland population. With regard to transnationalism, my model shows the convergence of not two, but three kinds of societies through immigrants: the homeland society, the hostland society, and contexts in elsewhere societies. And for diaspora, I show that immigrants are not always necessarily connected to peoples and places based on a diasporic sense of affinity with co-ethnics or on a sense of allegiance to a common homeland. Rather, they are connected to diverse peoples and diverse places based on global geopolitics and hostland dynamics. Since I finished writing my book in late 2019, I think now there is more evidence why we by we I mean migration scholars, need to locate immigrant experiences in connection to contexts not just here and there, but also elsewhere. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that what happens in a faraway foreign land does not stop at its borders, but can produce domino effects, social, political, epidemiological, forceful enough to lock down the entire world. And we can see more clearly, perhaps than any other time in recent memory, the power of globalization and how it intersects with local forms of boundary work like race, ethnicity, nationalism, religion. I look forward to discussing more about my findings during Q&A and during my discussion with you and Sangeeta. But thank you for allowing me to share my findings.
Thank you, Professor Shams. I have so many questions. I'm just thinking in my head. But first, I would like to invite Sangeeta to share with us her perspective while reading the book, and also while Professor Shams was presenting her insights about the book.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think what has been particularly interesting for me is also that I'm positioned within gender studies and I'm looking at the text from migration studies. So that has been very, very interesting, I think, for me. So how, at the heart of it, I think what I particularly find interesting is how migrant South Asian Muslim identities are getting constructed through of religion, nationality, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender, and in the process of finding home. And this is also interesting because associated with it, this book is asking a very core question on who has the power to define who can belong and what are the conditions and scripts of such belonging. So, drawing from that, I think I would like to ask maybe yeah. So the one thing that I thought I found interesting and I thought of asking is a central conception within the book is about Ummah and the Islamic solidarity. And I was thinking that while Ummah makes it possible for South Asian Americans to find solidarity among co-religionists, irrespective of their ethnic identities, and also within a very stringent surveillance of the government and pejorative representations of of media on the one hand, by offering to South Asian Muslim Americans a sort of epistemic privilege to understand their location and then confront entrenched Islamophobia. I'm also thinking if an ummatic sense of solidarity that draws on a single stratifier, in this case religion, if it can inadvertently also thwart the possibilities of solidarity along other intersectional lines, for example, gender, sexualities, or ethnicities, or maybe even nationality.
Mhm. Wow, that's such a great question. I used religion. I shouldn't even say Islam, but I used religion as a strategic lens to trace the global transnational connections that transcend territorial borders. But I should first mention that the multi-centered relational framework, or the elsewhere effect, is not necessarily only for Muslim communities. For example, if we use the multi-centered relational framework on Roman Catholics, we find that that the Irish in the United States, Irish Americans, were extremely stigmatized, were very discriminated because they were seen as not necessarily immigrants from a foreign land, Ireland, but they were seen as papists, agents of the Pope in the Vatican, who are working to subvert American democracy, right? So here we are not talking about Islam necessarily, but another religious group who is also seen through an association with an elsewhere place that is in a contentious relationship with the host land. Another thing that I should mention is that it doesn't always have to be based on religion. We look at how Eastern Europeans were seen as communists during the Red Scare, regardless of where they're coming from, and they were treated in the same way. We saw how Chinese Americans were perceived to be groups of other Eastern Asian countries during World War II, right? So it doesn't necessarily, even though I used religion as a strategic lens, that is not necessarily the only way in which we can look at these transnational connections. So we can also, just how I used ethnicity and nationality as alternative lenses than religion, we can also use sexuality and gender. Something that I haven't been able to study in this book, but something that I'm really interested in is how does the politics around sexuality of one country inform the politics surrounding sexuality of other countries? And how do these connections shape self-identification? How folks who identify with queer sexualities locate themselves in a global community? And how does that everyday negotiation between self-identity and identification by others connect for immigrants their homeland country, the hostland country, and the country that they think is affecting their sexuality politics, right? So you are the expert on gender. So I leave that up to you, Shangita, to show me the way about that. But I think that what you said about, well, certainly there is a way for solidarity, whether real or performative. Not necessarily solidarity is real all the time. Sometimes it's for performative reasons to fit in a particular kind of context as well. Well, if Ummah allows for performative or real solidarity, does that actually thwart other ways of forming coalitions? Absolutely. I don't have to go beyond religion. When I was doing my field work, there was certainly a sense of community and a sense of cleavage between those who identified as Sunni and those who identified as Shia. Even coming from the same country, Pakistan, people who identified as Ahmadis, for instance, had a completely different experience, homeland experience, than their fellow nationals. Even though in the United States, plated under the same category, they're seen as sometimes not even like given the respect of based on nationality. They were just conflated as brown folk or just Muslim-looking people. But the way that they connected to their homeland experience in the United States shaped what countries are elsewhere's for them. Whereas I have heard the few Shia Muslims I was privileged to interview mention Malaysia, Indonesia, Iran, places, well, not Iran in this sense, but places that they felt either were predominantly Shia or places where Shias were persecuted. Those were the places that were elsewheres for them. For Sunnis, I never heard in their interviews mentioning most of the places that were so salient for their Shia co-nationals, right? So definitely the way that the participants related to this imagined community of the Ummah shaped who they think would be inclusive for forming friendships, for forming marriages, right? I should also mention that the same religion also provided avenues to cross national borders, right? It was okay, for instance, for some to consider marrying a Muslim from India or Pakistan, but not someone of a different religion, but of the same nationality, right? So even though I used Ummah as an access point to bring the transnational, the cross-border connections to surface, absolutely no way can it be taken as granted that everyone who is Muslim, they seem to have some kind of a connection that thwarts them from having a connection with non-Muslims. Exactly what you said, that this question of who belongs and who gets to have a say in that can be traced at all levels. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant negotiation between self-identity and identification by others.
Thank you very much. In fact, I was also thinking in the context of who belongs and who decides who can belong, and also in the context of the scripts of belonging. So a recurring theme in the book and also for the audience is good, the idea of a good Muslim.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that in any given society, who becomes good? The idea of good itself is informed by a set of normatives of religion, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality codes, all of which coalesce to then form that normative that is then pitched on the bodies of individuals and has to be lived out. So
Absolutely.
now we have a yes.
I was going to say, absolutely. It's actually
Yes,
funny,
yes, yes.
sad and funny at the same time. how drastically the meanings attached to a good Muslim vary based on who I was interviewing and in what context. For example, when my interviewees understood that I was coming from a Muslim background, for them, but so when speaking to an insider, a perceived insider, a fellow Muslim, a good Muslim meant praying 5 times a day, fasting during Ramadan, um, you know, uh, not drinking, all these norms that are unspoken and taken for granted in the insider community, that this is what a good pious Muslim does. This overt expression of religiosity. But when that same person is among outsiders, perceived outsiders, non-Muslims, non-brown folk, you name it, then the definition of good Muslims mean not to show your religiosity, to show that religion doesn't matter. I'm really secular. I'd much rather watch a fun movie that has nothing to do with religion than get into a conversation with you about a politically subversive movie that came out about Muslim Americans, right? Pretending to drink from a cup just to fit in, right? So to outsiders, the definition of a good Muslim is secular, hardworking, politically passive, politically silent, not really religious. But for that same person, when with insiders, fellow Muslims, good Muslim is the complete opposite, overt expression of religiosity, whether or not they are actually religious.
Yes. In fact, there's a section in the book in which you talk about creative solutions to fit in without drawing attention to identity. And there's a wonderful reference of a Pakistani Pakistani filmmaker who arrives early at a party, takes a Coke and gives everyone the impression that he's drinking, or performs hyper and happy and having fun. So
that's actually very sad. Like, we have this extremely bright, hardworking young man who wants to break into his profession, having to navigate ways to silence, in a way, his true self in whatever that he sees himself. So there is a heart-wrenching dimension to that example, as hilarious as it is sometimes to think about it, just the flip-flop, but there's a heart-wrenching side to that.
I was also thinking I go back to the context of performing as the good Muslim, and thinking that now there are two competing set of normatives for those who are for South Asian Muslim Americans. One that is drawing from the homeland within the community, and now a new set of normatives on what it means to be a good Muslim, that is determined by a Western nation, a non-Muslim people almost, on who should be a good Muslim, and as Mamdani says, to quarantine Islam. So in this context, because it is now a kind of a hyper visible group with immense public scrutiny, how do members within the community, maybe less powerful members, how is it possible for them to articulate either violence in the community or some form of injustice, or confront members in the community, find justice, find validation, find resolution, without reinforcing some sort of derogatory idea of the community? So if your participants or their families, they spoke about it, or if you observe something from the data.
Well, I can think of several examples that I observed during fieldwork. For example, when there's a hurricane, when there's a national natural disaster, we have Muslims from MSAs, Muslim student associations or mosques,
Application.
producing a concerted effort with, wearing T-shirts that show, the name of their mosques or their group, uh, presenting themselves as concerned fellow Americans, good citizens. Yes, we are Muslim, but we are citizens, Americans, just like you. And it's not, I don't want to diminish these efforts by just saying that this is a presentation of self, this is performative. It's a sincere effort to claim, to lay a claim on their American selves that are often overlooked because of the way that they're conflated as just Muslims, right? So I can also recall a hijabi participant who makes sure that she's always smiling. Okay, she even even when she's driving and someone just calls out at her, Osama, Osama, she makes sure that she's smiling so that she does not reinforce this stereotype that she is hijabi, she is a religious person, and she's angry and violent, right? So this is, or sometimes right after a terrorist attack, there are some participants who choose to wear a colorful hijab, like pink, instead of black,
Pink, yes.
in order to distance themselves from the stereotypical Orientalist images of women clad in black that we often see in the news and in movies, or women who wear a cap instead of a scarf, still observing their religious practices, but taking a precautionary measure, a safety measure against any kind of violent Islamophobic encounter. So these are the different ways on a day-to-day level we see individuals responding to a collective violence, indirect or direct. But in my book, but more in depth in another paper that I had published, I also say that how harmful these individual instances are for the collective Muslim community, because these instances are trying to present Muslims as politically passive, at least not politically radical, more or less secular, that they are good Muslims, so they are not troublemakers, they're just hardworking people. And often what that means is that, yes, in the short term, you are getting ahead, or you are successfully avoiding Islamophobic encounters, especially when tensions are high. But you are also, in the long run, politically silencing yourselves, that you are not taking radical actions, radical political actions for problems that require radical solutions. You'd much rather be politically passive and hardworking and secular and not draw too much attention to yourselves, to your Muslim identity. But what that ends up being is that you are, politically silencing yourself and your community. So there are different creative solutions, like you said, that individuals do in order to negotiate that identity, to address that Islamophobic atmosphere. It has advantages, but it also has a double-edged sword. It also has disadvantages.
Did you also, I mean, of course, so much in the book is also how it becomes compelling. I mean, it's kind of like compelling for people to then present themselves as peaceful Muslims who are pro-peace, and it's a recurring theme. There are so many participants who are then articulating that they represent peace and they don't want trouble, and how they need to dissociate themselves from these incidents that are happening in these elsewhere. So I also wanted to ask you if you met participants who didn't want to then talk in the same line of action, in the sense also that each time Muslims, South Asian Muslims, have to present themselves as a peaceful people and obfuscate everything, it also means that they have to obfuscate the other socio-political history of Western nations with other nations, and then suddenly have to position themselves as a peace-loving people. So, did you also find participants who are not willing to conform to that idea, and then maybe present themselves more assertively in a more confronting way? And what
Well,
would this mean if they did that?
yeah, I don't want to use the word. I don't want to use the words confrontational or conflict or things like that, because my participants represent the majority of the everyday Muslims. They are peaceful people.
Okay.
They are regular people who, on an everyday basis, don't think about religion all the time. Right? We are just regular. Like, yeah, I'm a person who comes from a Muslim background. Religion is not on the forefront of my mind all the time. Right? When I'm watching TV, or when I'm eating, or when I'm deciding to wear, or deciding what to wear, when I'm talking to my husband or my niece, religion is not always on the top of my mind. Similarly, parents, their everyday concern, the top priority is raising the kids. For students, getting a good grade. For young professionals, getting ahead in their job, getting a promotion, getting a raise. Right? So I want to just say that I wanted to say that first, that we are talking about everyday people. And just like everyday people, these are peace-loving people. There is no performative element about this. None of my participants ever said anything to hint otherwise, that they sometimes, they have some terrorist sympathies. Absolutely not. What I did find is that, just like regular folks, they don't want to be talking about global geopolitics and Islamist terrorism all the time, right? Many of them just want to go by their day. But when there is a terrorist attack, we see immediately these people being associated by others to something Muslims did somewhere else in the world, right? Now, then they're forced to educate themselves about what exactly happened, who did this, why this happened, what I have to do, what are the precautionary safety measures that I have to take. So it's repetitive. It just happens again and again, to a point that when it becomes instinctive. If there's a breaking news, the first thought is, oh, please don't let it be Muslim. And then if it's Muslim, there is a script that has been quite naturalized already, that can I avoid going to class? What am I going to wear? Who am I going to meet the next day? Let me go on social media and see what's trending. What are some statistics that I can arm myself with, that if I have to present Muslims collectively again as peaceful people, what are some statistics that I can offer to make my case, right? So when I say that radical problems that require radical solutions, I don't mean anything that is not peaceful. What I mean is that sometimes problems need people to be vocal. That why don't all McDonald's, for instance, have halal options? Why do I have to opt for the vegetarian option because I want to be Zabiha? Why do I? Why? I am an American. I'm a part of the citizenry. So why are there not these accommodations or inclusions in these shops? It's just a matter of that, being vocal about what your community needs, what you want, inserting yourself into mainstream political conversations. Sometimes even that is radical, when the community is completely silent and trying to assimilate and accommodate without drawing attention to their needs and wants.
Um, these are so insightful, and also, you know,
So
you hear one thing
yeah,
and you
I was
feel like.
also in fact, yeah, okay, Firoz, yeah,
So,
please.
sorry, Sangita, আপনি জিজ্ঞেস করতে চাচ্ছিলেন? Please go on. I wanted to ask questions in Bangla. So,
না 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 আপনি হ্যাঁ প্লিজ গো হেড ইয়া
um, আপনি প্রফেসর শামস, আমি যেটা প্রথমে বলেছিলাম যে আমাদের অনেক অডিয়েন্স যারা আছেন, স্পেশালি আমাদের কনভারসেশনটা আমরা বাংলাদেশের ছেলেমেয়েদের খানিকটা ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিং ওই জায়গাটাতে প্রমোট করার চেষ্টা করি, অ্যান্ড বিকজ উই অল অফ আস উই স্পিক ইন বাংলা, উই ক্যান স্পিক ইন বাংলা, সো দ্যাটস এ ওয়ান্ডারফুল অপরচুনিটি টু এঙ্গেজ উইথ ইভেন ক্রিটিক্যাল কনভারসেশন। প্রায়ই আমি প্রশ্নটা জিজ্ঞেস করি, আমরা যারা প্রবাসী, উই আর ইমিগ্রেন্ট, আমরা আমাদের লাইফটাকে এভাবে পারফর্ম করি যে আমাদের লাইফ ইন আমেরিকা অর ইন ক্যানাডা, ইটস ইটস আ ল্যান্ড অফ মিল্ক অ্যান্ড হানি, আমাদের কোনো ডিফিকাল্টিস নেই। দ্যার ইজ এ সর্ট অফ, আমি বলছি না সবাই, বাট I have seen, and being a Bengali Muslim immigrant myself, I know যে বাংলাদেশ থেকে এখানে এসে সেটেল করা, তো সেখানে তো একটা পারফরমেটিভ একটা সোশ্যাল আইডেন্টিটি আমাদের কনস্ট্রাক্ট করতে হয় টু লিভ আপ টু দ্য এক্সপেকটেশন যে আমরা বাংলাদেশ থেকে বাইরে যাচ্ছি, হেন্স আওয়ার লাইফ ইজ ভেরি স্মুথ। অ্যান্ড তো আপনি, ইউ আর আ মাইগ্রেন্ট স্কলার, আপনার নিজের যে লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্স এবং যাদের সাথে আপনি কাজ করেছেন, do you think that we are sort of in a bit of a between rock and hard place, যে আমরা এখানে যে রিয়ালিটিটা লিভ করছি সেটাকে বলতে চাচ্ছি না বাংলাদেশে একটা পার্টিকুলার ইমেজ ধরে রাখার জন্য?
ওয়াও, আমি আসলে আমার ফিল্ড ওয়ার্কে এরকম কোনো কিছু দেখিনি। যেটা আমি আমার পার্সোনাল অভিজ্ঞতা এবং পার্সোনাল অবজারভেশন ইন মাই পার্সোনাল লাইফ যেটা আমি দেখেছি, সেটা হচ্ছে যে if you're talking about a family, যে মা বাবা তাদের ছেলে মেয়েদেরকে নিয়ে এসেছে, in most cases, if we are talking about the United States and Canada, we are talking about very high skilled people with high levels of formal education. This is not the case for immigrants who go to countries in Europe, particularly the UK. It's a huge sacrifice করেই কিন্তু মা বাবারা তাদের ছেলে মেয়েদেরকে নিয়ে এসেছে এখানে। ইউজুয়ালি যেটা হয় সেটা হচ্ছে ছেলে মেয়ে যাতে পড়াশোনা করার যাতে খুব ভালো সুযোগ পায় আমেরিকাতে, সেই জন্যই কিন্তু মা বাবা এরকম স্যাক্রিফাইস করে এসেছে। অ্যান্ড উই আর নট জাস্ট টকিং অ্যাবাউট মানি, উই আর নট জাস্ট টকিং অ্যাবাউট যে খুব ভালো চাকরি করতো, চাকরি ছেড়ে এসেছে শুধু ছেলে মেয়েদের দিকে তাকিয়ে। উই আর নট টকিং জাস্ট অ্যাবাউট দ্যাট, উই আর টকিং অ্যাবাউট একজন মানুষ যার এল্ডারলি প্যারেন্টস এর সাথে সে আর থাকতে পারছে না। Right? We're talking about a fundamental thread that ties together a family that's been cut এখানে আসার পরে। Immense একটা guilt থাকে for many immigrants, এই ওরকম ধরনের একটা ইমোশনাল স্যাক্রিফাইস করে আসলে, স্পেশালি ফর কান্ট্রিজ যেখানে আমরা দেখি যে ফ্যামিলি লাইফকে খুব প্রায়োরিটাইজ করা হয়। তো সেই ইমেন্স গিল্ট নিয়ে কিন্তু ইমিগ্রেন্টরা থাকে। And we see this particularly now in the time of COVID-19, যে আমরা অনেকেই কিন্তু এখন কানাডা বাংলাদেশে আছি who have been privileged to get the vaccine, either the first dose or both doses. কিন্তু আমরা কিন্তু ইমেন্স গিল্টে আছি যে আমাদের লাভড ওয়ান্সরা তারা কিন্তু মানে ফেটাল রিস্কে তারা এভরিডে লাইফ লিড করছে। So the reality is it's not milk and honey. The reality is যে আমরা যারা immigrant, আমাদের frame of mind, আমাদের frame of thinking, আমরা যেরকম ভাবে, even when we go to for years, I remember my dad, আমার বাবা দোকানে যেত, টাকায় কনভার্ট করতো সবকিছু, even though he's earning money in dollars, টাকায় কনভার্ট করতো। Just a everyday এক্সাম্পল যে কিরকম ভাবে আমাদের ডুয়াল ফ্রেম অফ মাইন্ড। আমরা সব সময় কিন্তু আমরা বাংলাদেশ থেকে এসেছি, না আমরা ইন্ডিয়া থেকে এসেছি, আমরা পাকিস্তান থেকে এসেছি, এরকম ভাবে একটা সেই লেন্স নিয়ে কিন্তু আমরা লিড করি। আমাদের হ্যাপিনেস যখন খুব খুশির একটা নিউজ হয়, আমার মা বাবা দুইজনই বলে, ইস তোমার দাদু থাকতো, তোমার নানু থাকতো, এটা তোমার খালামণির সাথে তুমি শেয়ার করতে পারতা। সো there is a huge advantage, privilege when immigrants come from developing countries to developed countries. কিন্তু সেটার সাথে যেটা আমি বললাম, যেটা immense একটা sacrifice থাকে. So some people, just like you said, Firoz, যে হয়তোবা feel করে যে their families back home যাদেরকে ওনারা were forced to leave behind for their children's well-being, তাদেরকে তাদেরকে একটা একটা সুসংবাদ দেওয়ার যে আমাদের যে কালেকটিভ যে স্যাক্রিফাইসটা আমরা করেছি ফর আওয়ার নেক্সট জেনারেশন, ইটস ওয়ার্থ ইট। সেটা আই উড নট বি সারপ্রাইজ, যদিও আমি আমার কোনো ইন্টারভিউয়ে আমার সাথে শেয়ার করেনি এসব জিনিস। আমি আমার পার্সোনাল স্টোরি, পার্সোনাল অবজারভেশনস নিয়ে, অফকোর্স ইটস আ ভেরি কমন স্টোরি যে এল্ডারলি মা বাবাকে একটা ওভারলি অপটিমিস্টিক একটা ভিউ দেওয়া যে না মা বাবা আমি পড়াশোনা করতে এসেছি, আমার কিন্তু সে জানে যে তার খুব কষ্ট হচ্ছে অ্যাজ এন ইন্টারন্যাশনাল স্টুডেন্ট, মেবি হি অর শি ইজ নট এবল টু ফিট ইন, ঠিকভাবে হয়তো বা খেতে পারছে না, প্রত্যেকটা টাকা, প্রত্যেকটা ডলার, প্রত্যেকটা সেন্ট তার হিসাব করে চলতে হচ্ছে, বাট মা বাবাকে বলতে চাচ্ছে না এই জিনিসটা। So I can see that happening in many households, but the story why people are doing that is not for a status boost or an ego. I think most of the time it's a story of love. যে immense sacrifice করে আমরা এসেছি, একটা collective endeavor, একজন ইমিগ্রেন্টের পিছনে একটা entire community involved তাকে পাঠানোর most of the time, যে it's worth it. Failure is out of the question. আমাদের succeed করতেই হবে, because we have already paid the price for that.
I mean, you have put it very powerfully that failure is not an option. But আমার কাছে somehow এটাকে মনে হয় যেটা একটা নিওলিবারাল যে প্রেশারটা, যে সমস্ত ব্যর্থতা আমার, এখানে স্টেট বা একটা ইকোনমিক সিস্টেম, পলিটিক্যাল সিস্টেম এর কোনো এঙ্গেজমেন্ট নেই, পুরো ব্যর্থতাটাই আমার। এখানে আমি দিয়া খানের ওয়ার্কটাকে যদি এখানে টানি, যে পার্টিকুলারলি মুসলিম আইডেন্টিটি, ফিল্ম মেকার দিয়া খান, যে আমরা যখন এই জায়গাটাতে আসি, আমাদের ডিসকাশনে আজকে যেটা পার্সোনালি আমার কাছে ভীষণ গুরুত্বপূর্ণ মনে হয়েছে, মি অ্যাজ আ প্যারেন্ট, মি অ্যাজ আ ব্রাদার, মি অ্যাজ আ টিচার, মি অ্যাজ আ বাংলাদেশি বা বাঙালি, এই সবগুলো অ্যাজ এ মুসলিম হিসেবে, যে আপনি যেটা বললেন যে ফেইলিয়ার ইজ নট অ্যান অপশন, দিস ইজ ট্রু। অ্যাট দ্য সেম টাইম, বিশেষ করে ক্যানাডার প্রেক্ষাপটে, আমেরিকার চাইতে ক্যানাডার প্রেক্ষাপটে ব্যাপারটা ভীষণ আলাদা, যে আমাদের গ্লোবাল একটা ইমেজ হচ্ছে ক্যানাডা, যে উই আর দ্য মোস্ট পিসফুল প্লেসেস, মোস্ট পিসফুল প্লেস অন আর্থ। 2 দিন বা 3 দিন আগে যখন ব্রিটিশ কলম্বিয়াতে উই ফাউন্ড মানে দি রিমেইনস অফ 215 চিলড্রেনস বডি। তো এই যে ক্যানাডার যে কলোনিয়াল ক্রুয়েলটি বা ক্যানাডার যে ইমেজটা, আমি যদি পর্টারের সেই কথা বলি যে আপনার ভার্টিক্যাল মোজাইক, যে এটা আমরা বলছি এটা মোজাইক, আমেরিকাতে আসলে আপনি আপনার আইডেন্টিটিকে আপনাকে স্যাক্রিফাইস করতে হবে, আপনার ওখানে আর বাঙালি থাকতে পারবেন না, আপনাকে আমেরিকান হতে হবে। কিন্তু ক্যানাডায় আসলে আপনাকে সেটা হতে হবে না, এখানে আসলে আপনি বাঙালি থাকতে পারবেন। কিন্তু কথাটা তো সত্যি না, আমাকে এখানে এসেও সেই হায়ারার্কির ভিতরে পড়তে হবে। তো আমরা যখন এরকম একটা ইমেজটাকে ক্রিটিক্যালি প্রেজেন্ট করি না, তখন যারা ক্যানাডাতে আসে, আমার মনে হয় না, at least I remember the first time I came to Canada, my professor's husband came to pick me up. I didn't have any prior family in Canada, and he's a historian by training. He asked me this question, যে ফিরোজ, কানাডা সম্বন্ধে তোমার ধারণা কি? আমি বলেছিলাম যে I think Canada is the most peaceful place in the earth. তো উনি আমাকে হেসে বলেছিলেন যে মেবি ইউর ওপিনিয়ন উইল চেঞ্জ ইন জাস্ট ইন ইটস বিন 7-8 ইয়ার্স, এন্ড আই কুডন্ট এগ্রি মোর উইথ হিম। তো আপনি আমেরিকাতেও থেকেছেন, বড় হয়েছেন, ওখানে লেখাপড়া করেছেন, এখন আপনি কানাডাতে পড়াচ্ছেন, ইউনিভার্সিটিতে পড়াচ্ছেন। এই যে আমাদের মুসলিম আইডেন্টিটি, আমরা যে এখানে যে ধরনের আইডেন্টিটিটা নেগোশিয়েট করি, সঙ্গীতা বলেছেন পারফর্মেটিভ যে একটা অ্যাসপেক্টটা, কোন একটা জায়গায় গিয়ে আমরা ওই জায়গাটাতে গিয়ে সামহাউ পারফর্ম করার চেষ্টা করি যে না আমি আসল মুসলমান, আমি মডারেট, ওই ডুয়ালিটিটা। এখানে আমার কাছে যে জিনিসটা ডিফিকাল্ট মনে হয়, আমাদের ইন্টারনাল মুসলিম প্র্যাকটিসেস there are some violent aspects. If we think about honor killing, if we think about মানে gender areas of violence. আমি জানি যে জায়গাটা খুব সেনসিটিভ। মানে Islamophobia is real. At the same time, if we don't go into that sticky area, if we don't examine it critically, then perhaps, in order to build a critical consciousness, could be a challenging task. আপনি ওই ইন্টারসেকশনটাকে কিভাবে দেখেন?
Well, that's a very tough question. Karon, like you said, that at an internal একটা discussion আমাদের দরকার. I don't want to get into any kind of political weeds here, but to have a healthy debate, a healthy conversation about what Bangladeshi means, about what being a Bengali means as opposed to Bangladeshi. What does being a good Muslim mean? At a moderate Muslim, maniki good Muslim. What does being secular mean? A প্রশ্নগুলা are such open wounds for many South Asian national and ethnic groups. It's very tough to even initiate internal conversations, but it is especially আমরা যারা দূর থেকে আমাদের loved ones এর কথা চিন্তা করে যখন আমরা এসব ব্যাপার নিয়ে চিন্তা করি তখন মনে হয় just how incredibly important it is যে আমাদের internally discussion গুলো হয়. But at the same time, I am always hesitant to talk about honor killings and radical Islamism, terrorism in every space, every public context, is because even so, every community has something like this. একটা খুবই critical, একটা unwanted একটা ব্যাপার, একটা huge struggle. Child marriage is another one. But when we are here in the West, যখন আমরা এরকম ধরনের conversation করি, what it ends up doing is it ends up perpetuating this larger, sometimes overarching narrative যে আমরা খুবই একটা খারাপ poor একটা barbaric society থেকে এসেছি. Not all communities, not all races, not all ethnic groups, not all national groups are asked to collectively have a conversation about it. So I just wanted to voice my hesitations and my caution when having these very important conversations, so as to not perpetuate orientalized images যেটা কিন্তু outsiderরা are more familiar with, unfortunately. আমরা কিন্তু খুবই কম দেখি stories of accomplishment, stories of success, যে GDP growth, for instance. আমরা কিন্তু সেগুলা কম দেখি, আমরা কিন্তু এইসব জিনিস আরো বেশি দেখি. I'm talking from a diasporic perspective, obviously. So আমি যেরকম ভাবে জিনিসগুলোকে দেখি যে খুবই ইম্পর্টেন্ট যে আমরা এইসব কনভারসেশন অ্যাজ আ নেশন একটা হেলথি সেফ একটা এনভায়রনমেন্টে আমরা করতে পারি. That there is intellectual freedom, there's academic freedom in the universities at every level, not just universities, at schools as well. যেখানে students are not just regurgitating what they're learning from their teachers, but they have a say in what they want to learn, what they want to know about, of challenging something that they disagree with. আমি যখন বাংলাদেশে ছিলাম তখন সেটা খুব কম ছিল, সেটা আমার বাসায় কালটিভেট করা হতো, আমার মা বাবা কালটিভেট করতো ডিলিজেন্টলি, যেটা আমি অনেক সময় পাবলিক স্পেসে পাইনি. So it's extremely important যে আমরা as a nation, I appreciate the word internal here, at an internal conversation, at a safe, healthy way to kora, a debate kora, without fear of serious repercussions. Kintu for those of us who are in the West, এটা আমাদের জন্য কিন্তু extra sensitive, because we want to represent our countries, our groups in a healthy way, a safe way, and in a positive way, in a balanced way, but in a positive way. সেটা কিন্তু সেই opportunity কিন্তু সবসময় আমরা পাই না. Sometimes we are invited to talk about child marriages, FGM, things like that, without any kind of context about the progress our societies have made. আমরা কিন্তু শুরুই করি হচ্ছে অনেক বড় প্রবলেম, আমাদের এটা সমাধান করতে হবে, এটা খুবই খারাপ, এরকম জিনিস হয়। কিন্তু আমাদের দেশে কিন্তু অনেক অর্গানাইজেশন আছে, নন প্রফিট আছে, অনেক স্কলাররা আছে, who are working every day to change that as much as they can. আমরা কিন্তু কনভারসেশন সেখান থেকে শুরু করি না যে আমরা কোথা থেকে কোথায় আসতে পেরেছি এবং আমাদের আরো কত দূর যেতে হবে. So these are my thoughts, that it's a very sensitive intersection, as you said, and extra sensitive, I think, for those of us who are in the West and trying to advance that kind of conversation, that আমাদের extra careful হতে হয় এইসব ব্যাপারে.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. And I always, আমি যখনই ওয়েস্টের কোনো একটা ক্রিটিক্যাল জায়গা থেকে I have had I have been a teacher all my life, এবং আপনি যে কথাটা মাত্র বললেন যে
if I can, I'm sorry.
Sure, Sangeeta, go ahead, please. Sangeeta, আপনি প্রশ্ন করতে চাইছিলেন, please go ahead. Sangeeta, আপনি শুনতে পাচ্ছেন আমাকে? You can ask the question, please. আচ্ছা, মনে হয় Sangeeta শুনতে পাচ্ছে না. So let me ask the next question.
No, I was just thinking that I understand this context, but I'm yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah. So I'm also thinking that in this context where there is, of course, that larger political scrutiny and everything else that's going on, and a larger Islamophobic environment. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, okay. So I'm also thinking, like I said, what is this? It's an extremely pressurizing environment, because particularly for maybe members in a community who may be experiencing some form of inequality. And I'm also drawing from experiences of Sikh women, Indian Sikhs who have migrated to the UK and who have to now address domestic violence and are now again getting constructed as traditional Indian. And so I understand that, but I'm also thinking that within this environment, what is the possibility for either women or LGBTQ groups or men to talk about or articulate their differences with the community? Yeah. Especially if they have to also ensure that they don't get succumbed into that larger narrative of a backward people.
Yeah. So I thank you, Sangeeta, for that input. This is exactly what I was saying about a very sensitive intersection, because oftentimes, especially when we live in especially when people live in repressive societies, usually the only way that you can speak out is after you have exited that society, that country. So একটা countryতে যেখানে LGBTQ peopleদেরকে extremely persecute করা হচ্ছে, the only way people from that country can speak out for that community against the repressive regime is যখন সে অন্য দেশে কথা বলছে, when the strong arm of the home state can no longer reach them. কিন্তু যেটা বলছিলাম, যেটা খুব sensitive intersection is they are now under another strong arm, যেটা বলছে যে তোমরা repressive country থেকে এসেছো, that is your story and that is your identity. So that's what I've been saying, is that when you are speaking from the diaspora, you have another layer of meaning that you have to negotiate, that you have to contend with. সেই meaningটা হচ্ছে তখন on one hand speaking against that repressive regime, but at the same time saying, hold on, that country with the repressive regime that I'm from is not all that bad. So on one hand we're defending it, on the other hand we're speaking against it. So that's what I've been saying. There's a very sensitive intersection that we have to deal with when we're speaking from the diaspora. I think, Firoz, you wanted to say something as well. I'd love to hear what you have to say on this topic.
আমার নিজের রিসার্চ হচ্ছে ডিজিটাল স্পেস নিয়ে। আমার কাছে যেটা মনে হয় যে আপনি আইডেন্টিটি নেগোসিয়েশনের যে কথাটা বললেন, একটা জায়গা হচ্ছে যে আমরা যখন বাংলাদেশে থাকি কিংবা ভারতে, পাকিস্তানে, নেপালে থাকি, ওই জায়গাটা তো একটা সময় ছিল জিওগ্রাফিক্যালি ডিমার্কেটেড, যে ওই একটা পার্টিকুলার জায়গার মধ্যেই আমরা বাস করছি। কিন্তু যখন ডিজিটাল স্পেসে আমরা মানে আমাদের নিজেদের সাবজেক্টিভিটি যে পারফর্ম করি, সেই জায়গাটা কিন্তু আপনার ডিজিটাল বা টেম্পোরাল সেই ডিমার্কেশনটা নেই। তো ধরুন আপনি এমন একটা অনুষ্ঠানে গেলেন, যে অনুষ্ঠানে আমি খুব একটা নাইভ এক্সাম্পল বলি, যেমন ধরুন এই সামার হয়েছে, আপনি লেটস ইউ আর ওয়্যারিং এ শর্টস এন্ড ইউ আর ওয়াকিং, মানে আই এম সেইং অ্যাজ আ ম্যান, দ্যাটস ইট। তো তখন লেটস সে I have practicing Muslim brothers and sisters back in home, they'll be like, oh, you are now not performing a certain you're violating a particular religious norm. তো আপনি এটা নিয়ে আগেও বলেছেন যে গ্লোবালাইজেশনের যে ভায়োলেন্ট ফর্মটা, এখন যেটা আমার কাছে যেটা মনে হয় যে বিকজ অফ ডিজিটাল ক্যাপিটালিজম, সেই স্পেস এবং টাইম, সেই জিওগ্রাফি স্পেসগুলো এত কম্প্রেস করে গেছে এবং আমাদের কনসিয়াসনেসটা এত বেশি এখন হাইপার কানেক্টেড, যে এখন অপারেট করার জন্য আমাদের ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিং, আমাদেরকে এই ক্রিটিক্যাল কনসিয়াসনেস ডেভেলপ করা ছাড়া আই ডোন্ট নো হাউ টু ন্যাভিগেট। আই ডোন্ট নো ইফ আই ডোন্ট থিঙ্ক, I don't know if I don't engage in a dialogue. And I, again, with respectfully saying dialogue, not essentially debate, Jay, I want to understand your perspective. I want to understand your point of view so that we can actually exist. তো আপনি যে কথাটা বলেন যে আমাদের ডাবল এজটা, বাংলাদেশ থেকে এখানে এসেছি, আমাকে একটা পার্টিকুলার সাবজেক্টিভিটি পারফর্ম করতে হবে টু মিট দ্য স্ট্যান্ডার্ড অফ বাংলাদেশ। আমি আবার কানাডাতে থাকছি, এখানকার সোসাইটিতে আমাকে এভাবে প্রমোট করতে হবে যে আমি মডারেট মুসলিম। আপনি একটা পেপার লিখেছেন যে বেসিক্যালি বাংলাদেশিরা কিভাবে, হাউ ডু দে পারফর্ম দেমসেলভস ইন এ পার্টিকুলার সিচুয়েশন। তো আমার কাছে ওই জিনিসটা মানে ইটস ভেরি ক্রিটিক্যাল, ইটস ভেরি ডিফিকাল্ট এবং চ্যালেঞ্জিং। তো সেই জায়গাটা আর আপনি বাংলাদেশ না শুরু পুরো পৃথিবীতে, ইউ আর টিচিং অ্যাট ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ টরন্টো, আই ডোন্ট থিঙ্ক ইটস ভেরি ডিফারেন্ট ইন ইউএফটি এজ ওয়েল, ইজ দ্যাট I can fairly say with a bit of confidence যে সারা পৃথিবীতেই যেখানে ক্রিটিক্যাল কনসিয়াসনেস প্রমোট করা, ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিং ইজ বেসড অন ইট লিমিটেড। এটা শুধু বাংলাদেশে না, ইটস অল ওভার দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড। তো সেই জায়গাটাতে এই ডায়ালগ গুলো যদি আমরা এঙ্গেজ না করি, তাহলে আপনি যে ট্রায়াডের কথাটা বলছেন, হিয়ার, দেয়ার অ্যান্ড এলসওয়্যার, we have that kind of triads not only in America, not only in Canada. You have the same triad if you go to Myanmar right now, if you go to India right now, if you go to Bangladesh right now. Our treatment towards the indigenous people, our treatment towards the minority people. তো ওই যে কম্প্রেশনটা, সেই কম্প্রেশনটা যে টেনশন ক্রিয়েট করছে, সেই টেনশনের যে আন্ডারলাইং যে ফোর্সগুলো, আমার কাছে আমি প্রায় maybe I have some kind of predilection to go towards Marxist analyst often and often, is social যে dialectical যে রিলেশনটা, সেটা তো কন্টিনিউয়াসলি প্রডিউস করতে হয়, whether it is religion দিয়ে হোক, কিংবা এটা আপনার মানে আনসিভিলাইজড আদার দিয়ে হোক, কিংবা এলসওয়্যার দিয়ে হোক। তো ওইটাকে যখন আমরা বুঝতে পারবো না, তখন তো আমরা তো মারামারি করতেই থাকবো, we will keep on মানে fighting with each other. তো আমার এটা অবজারভেশন। আমি কয়েকটা কমেন্ট নিতে চাচ্ছিলাম প্রফেসর শামস, যে thank you. This is so relatable. It will help me contextualize privilege and network if I move away from this dyad as proposed by the book? I mean, not that I can, say much about it. এখানে চপল আপা লিখেছেন যে may I read the review of the book? I'm sure Dr. Sangeeta has written a wonderful review, and I can send her the link
it's
from here.
online on the
হ্যাঁ একটা অনেক বড় কোয়েশ্চেন আছে, আমি জানি না বেসিক্যালি হাউ টু অ্যাড্রেস ইট, যে how can a good Muslim become a good citizen where the script they follow as Muslims totally reject non-believers, non-Muslims? The script also engraves deep roots to invite others to their belief. Also, the Sharia laws, should they choose what to believe from the script to fit in? Or should they just ignore the culture and environment they live in and pick up the ideals of Islam rather than their identity of being a good citizen? How does young immigrant balance their sense of self? It's a very challenging question. I don't know how to go about it.
Well, thank you so much for this, like Firoz said, a very challenging question. But I think I would like to talk about maybe what the script means. It's not the Sharia law. Good Muslims, when I see the South Asian immigrants following the good Muslim script that I talk about, it's not the Sharia law. My participants represent the extreme heterogeneity of the Muslim American population. I have interviewed people who identify as LGBTQ, but they identify as Muslim. They're strong believers in Islam. I have interviewed people who are Zabiha, but they wear what Bangladeshi norms would consider very Western liberal clothing. I have interviewed women who wear modest Muslim clothes, but they're open to smoking weed. Right, so it's very heterogeneous. One of the reasons that I talk about these communities is going back to coming full circle to what Sangeeta says: who has the power to say you belong? My answer is no one. No one other than you should have the power to say you belong. Because what happens is that we have a lot of gatekeeping going on, that you are a good Muslim and you're not a good Muslim, and so on and so forth. And everyone feels that they don't belong, and it causes other kinds of pressures within the community. But I don't think the good Muslim narrative rejects non-Muslims. The good Muslim narrative is about how we are just like you, non-Muslims. Please don't make us into a violent other that is out to get you. যে আমরা তোমাকে terrorize করতে এসেছি. The good Muslim narrative, both when among insiders and when among outsiders, is আমরা কিন্তু তোমাদের মতন। আমাদের চাওয়া, ইচ্ছা, বাচ্চাদেরকে সুন্দরভাবে রেইজ করা, পড়াশোনা করা, চাকরিতে এগিয়ে যাওয়া, সোসাইটিতে সুন্দরভাবে থাকা, আমাদের চাওয়া পাওয়া কিন্তু একদম এক। The way that we communicate or try to communicate that based on where we are, that's where the good Muslim script, the narrative, changes. So I would like to politely disagree that the good Muslim narrative that my participants espouse rejects non-Muslims. It's in fact the opposite. They're trying to fit in as equal citizens. Muslim or non-Muslim doesn't matter. So that's how I would at least try to address this very complex and an important question that the audience member has asked.
এখানে একটা জায়গা আমি I want to bring you back to this here, Professor Shams, যে এই যে আপনি বললেন যে কার রাইট আছে বিলং করার, who has the right to belong. তো আপনি এখন যদি, let's say I'm giving example of Toronto. Toronto is one of the most diverse places in the world. The 51% people who are not born in Toronto, not born in Canada, they live there. তো এখানে যখন when somebody comes from, let's say, Europe, let's say somebody who is European white immigrant here, in comparison to somebody who has a very obvious Muslim name, brown skin, I mean, আমি যদি চাইও to I am like you, I am like you, আপনি যে একটু আগে সুন্দর একটা এক্সাম্পল দিলেন যে people who come from an oppressive place and they escape that place and they come under, I would want to add, they come under even a stronger arm. মানে বাংলাদেশ বা পাকিস্তান কিংবা নেপাল কিংবা ভারত এখানকার যে আর্মগুলো আছে, এখানে আসার পরে আমাদের একটা পারফরমেটিভ স্বাধীনতা দেয়া হয় টু সাম এক্সটেন্ট। বাট আপনি যে কথাটা বললেন যে র্যাডিক্যাল চেঞ্জের ব্যাপার যখন আসে, when Malcolm X talked about changes, he was not, মানে when he says any means necessary, right? So any means necessary বললে তো তার মানে তো এই না যে মানে you keep on slapping me and I'll keep on turning the other cheek, you know, and therefore I am peaceful. I am peaceful because I am okay to put up with your violence. তো যখন মানে Malcolm X, when he stood up, he was portrayed in one way or the other. তো এরকম একটা চ্যালেঞ্জিং সিচুয়েশনে হোয়াইট বা ইউরোপিয়ান ইমিগ্রেন্টদের এখানে বিলং করাটা যতটা কনভিনিয়েন্ট বা ইজি বা রেডিলি অ্যাভেলেবল যে স্ট্রাকচারাল ওয়েলকামনেস, সেটা তো আমার আপনার কিংবা আমার সন্তানের হবে না।
আসলে this is a what you just said, Firoz, is extremely important and something that we don't often investigate really critically. Amar kintu it was a lot more easier for me to integrate to Canada than many white people who come here. Karon ki amar chamra hoyto ba brown, but I come here with the highest level of education from one of the top universities in the world. I had amar immigration এর জন্য আমাকে কিছু করতে হয়নি. I had that privilege কারণ আমার ইউনিভার্সিটি করে দিয়েছে আমার জন্য সেটা। আমি যেখানেই যাই আমার প্রফেশন আমাকে অনেক অ্যাভিনিউজ, অনেক প্রিভিলেজেস দেয়, whether it is to go see a good doctor or not, যেটা কিন্তু অ্যাভারেজ সাদা চামড়ার মানুষ যারা আসছে আমার চেয়ে অনেক কম এডুকেশন নিয়ে, তারা কিন্তু নাহলে তারা স্ট্রাগল করছে তাদের প্রফেশনে, নাহলে তারা এমন একটা কান্ট্রি থেকে আসছে যেখানে তারা পারসিকিউটেড হয়েছে। সো a white person from Bosnia is not the same as a white person coming from France, right? So আমরা যখন সাদা বলি তখন কিন্তু আমাদের চিন্তা করতে হবে যে সব সাদা ঠিক যেরকম সব মুসলমান এক না, সব সাদাও কিন্তু এক না। Again, going back to this, যেটা war torn, savaged, ravaged country থেকে এসেছে, বসনিয়া থেকে যে সাদা চামড়ার মানুষ এসেছে, তার এক্সপিরিয়েন্স কিন্তু is not again milk and honey এই দেশে আসার পরে। তাকে হয়তো সাদা হিসেবে হ্যাঁ তোমার সাদা প্রিভিলেজ আছে, তোমার কিচ্ছুই করতে হয় না, খুব ইজিলি ইয়ে করে গেলা, সে কিন্তু পঙ্গু হয়ে এসেছে তার দেশ থেকে, তাই না? সো I want to bring that nuance, that intersectional lens to this conversation, যে হ্যাঁ on one hand আমরা যখন এখানে আসি আমাদের as brown folk অনেক ধরনের প্রশ্নের সম্মুখীন হতে হয়, starting from the naive where are you from, ঠিক আছে, সেখান থেকে শুরু হয়, যেটা হয়তো বা একটা সাদা চামড়ার মানুষের করতে হয় না on an everyday basis। তারা অনেক কিছু based on how they are perceived externally, তারা অনেক privileges, অনেক কিছু পায়, কিন্তু again going back to that nuance between performative and real, what is perceived and what is real, সে আরেকটা লেয়ার আছে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে again in a those of us who are coming with very high skilled visas, আমরা কিন্তু ব্রাউন হয়েও আমাদের একটা প্রিভিলেজ আছে, right? We are the successful group, কিন্তু সেই সাকসেসফুল গ্রুপটাও কিন্তু সবসময় থাকে না। সেই mantle of being a successful minority group slips away when there is a tension, যে no one remembers we're the successful minority when a terrorist attack happens. We slip back to being the vulnerable, stigmatized, angry Muslim group, or however you want to phrase it. So we're talking about things that are very fluid, identities that are very intersectional, things, processes that are not black and white. It's even more complex when you are talking about immigrants. কারণ আমরা তখন কিন্তু শুধুমাত্র একটা হোস্ট সোসাইটি যেরকম ভাবে ইমিগ্রেন্টকে দেখছে সাদা, ব্রাউন, কালো, not the same. আফ্রিকা থেকে যারা ফার্স্ট জেনারেশন হয়ে যারা আসছে, say from Kenya, from Nigeria, তারা কিন্তু let's use Kenya as an example. Extreme education নিয়ে তারা আসছে, dedication to education. তাদের experience as immigrants কিন্তু very different than African Americans who've been struggling to get their rights in North America, in the United States especially. তো আমরা যখন এসব জিনিস নিয়ে যখন সাদা, কালো, ব্রাউন হিসেবে কথা বলি, there are just so many gradations and they're so fluid যে সেই কনভারসেশনটা কিন্তু আমরা সবসময় সেই ফ্লুইডিটি, সেই নুয়ান্সটা কিন্তু আমরা সবসময় কনভারসেশন আনি না। So I wanted to just mention যে I'm sure যে একজন সাদা চামড়ার মানুষ তার অনেক ধরনের প্রশ্ন সম্মুখীন হতে হয় না যেটা আমার হতে হয়। Where are you from? I'm from America. No, where are you really from? Like, no, I'm from America. আমিও জিদ ধরে বলি যে কতবার জিজ্ঞাসা করবো আমাকে, কতবার আমি রেজিস্ট করবো এই কোয়েশ্চেন। But at the same time, like I said, যে আমার পড়াশোনা, আমার প্রফেশন কিন্তু আমাকে একটা অ্যাডভান্টেজ দিচ্ছে, যেটা একটা অন্য সাদা মানুষের হয়তোবা সেটা নাই।
অ্যাবসলিউটলি। এই যে ওই পয়েন্টটার সাথে যদি আমরা এই জায়গাটা দেখি যে ধরুন আপনি you have gone to one of the best institutions in America. You are teaching the best university in Canada, University of Toronto, the largest institution, oldest institution. এই যে আপনার যে academic capital, cultural capital, these are also, if I go into the whole point of double consciousness, যে আপনি you can switch code, you can say perform and let's say claim your, let's say existence বলেন কিংবা আপনার significance বলেন through a set of কি বলে skills, through a set of performativity. কিন্তু ওই জায়গাগুলোতে যদি খেয়াল করি, সেই জায়গাগুলো, ফর এক্সাম্পল আপনি you graduated from UCLA, আপনি ইউএফটিতে পড়াচ্ছেন, লেটস সে একই সময়ে যদি ধরেন বাংলাদেশ থেকে জাহাঙ্গীরনগর বিশ্ববিদ্যালয় বা কোনো ইউনিভার্সিটি থেকে কেউ যদি পড়াশোনা করে আসতো, সে যদি if that same person did not have the kind of cultural capital, social capital, academic capital, that you have acquired, তাহলে কিন্তু তার এখানে ইন্টিগ্রেট করাটা would not be that easy. So although your skin is brown, my skin is brown, but I perform many whiteness in academic spaces. I perform many whiteness. I can switch code easily when I go to the other spaces. কিন্তু নর্মটা আমাকে তো ইন্টিগ্রেট করতে হবে সেই I cannot talk, I cannot be who I am and be comfortable. আমি জানি যে কারোর জন্যই সহজ না. So sorry, that was my last observation. I know that we are ending towards the discussion today.
Well, there isn't anything that you said that I disagree. Like, I absolutely have made those same observations. It's just that sometimes the conversations that we are having is regressive. We are having the same kinds of conversations. Not here. I'm talking about like when we talk about experiences of immigrants, especially brown-toned immigrants, whether or not they're Muslims. It's only when we understand যে কি পরিমাণ nuanced এবং কি পরিমাণ complex identity negotiation, I think that we are able to move forward. That's why I responded to you in that way, is that these are some of the nuances that I feel are not talked about. And you can also say that আমরা যারা একটা privileged একটা situation নিয়ে যখন আসি, তখন there are things that we should talk about and we don't, to hold on to those privileges, right? আমরা কিন্তু চাই না কঠিন ব্যাপারে কথা বলতে, কারণ আমাদের মধ্যে একটা ভয় থাকে। এক, আমরা বাংলাদেশ থেকে এসেছি, failure is not an option. দুই, অনেক কষ্ট করে একটা জায়গা খুঁজে পেয়েছি এই নতুন অচেনা একটা দেশে, সেই জায়গাটা হারাতে চাই না। আর ৩ হচ্ছে যে জানি কিরকম রিপ্রেসিভ গভর্নমেন্টে থেকে জীবন কেমন হয়। এখানকার রিপ্রেসিভ গভর্নমেন্টের আন্ডারে ঢুকতে চাই না। ভালো হয়ে থাকতে চাই। So we have these platforms and privileges to talk about these things, but we often don't. Um,
থ্যাংক ইউ প্রফেসর শামস। ওই বিষয়টাকে আপনি ক্লারিফাই করার জন্য অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ যে আমাদের সবারই কথা বলার বাক স্বাধীনতা থাকে না, কিন্তু যাদের থাকে তারা যখন চুপ করে থাকি আমরা, we are siding with the oppressors, plain and simple as it is. And this is what I happen to believe. Sangeeta, mane your last question, comments before we complete.
Yeah, I think I was also kind of caught up in while this discussion was happening, thinking about um, my own country and some of us who absolutely, irrespective of our political position, we reek of privileges, and how safe we are in this part of the world, because there are minorities, very, very significant numbers of Muslim minorities now in the country, with new laws that are also constructing neighboring countries as those dangerous elsewhere, from where Hindus and other minorities have to be protected. So it's interesting, and I was also thinking on what this would mean. What this would mean, I mean, these new uh, Citizenship Amendment Act and everything else, what this would mean for minorities in the country, Muslim minorities in this country, and particularly because now suddenly we have a dominant Hindu population who are also sort of performing an idea of normalcy, of neutrality, of status quo, and how dangerous this is. Like you, I mean, I'm drawing from what you said. I mean, those who have the power to say, to articulate, and what happens when they are silent. So yes, I mean, this is so I would say it's interesting that this conversation about the text is not only about its participants and its research, but how far it can take us and how it helps us understand our own context, irrespective of where we are positioned, and also how critically and how interrogatively some of us who are positioned in within many privileges now need to look at ourselves and decide what kind of positions we need to take.
Professor Shams, we come to you to conclude the program. যে আপনার স্কলারশিপ, আপনার বই, সেখান থেকে as বাঙালি ইমিগ্রেন্ট, মুসলিম ইমিগ্রেন্ট, সাউথ এশিয়ান ইমিগ্রেন্ট, অথবা যারা ওই দেশগুলো থেকে আমাদের কথাগুলো শুনছেন, what are some of the provocations or things you would want us to take away and think about, reflect upon, to have a more critical consciousness towards participating in this hyper-connected globalized world?
Wow, that's probably the most difficult question I was asked today. My goals are a lot modest. যদি আমার বই নিয়ে আমি বলি, সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমি যখন বাংলাদেশ থেকে আমি প্রথম আমেরিকাতে আসি, যখন আমি পড়াশোনা করা শুরু করি, I was very lucky যে I was able to work with scholars যারা genuine interest নিয়ে এগিয়ে এসেছিল আমার সাথে কাজ করার জন্য। কিন্তু the general context যেটা আমি দেখেছিলাম, সেটা হচ্ছে যে বাংলাদেশীদের স্টোরি কোথাও নাই। আমরা যখন সাউথ এশিয়ানদেরকে নিয়ে কোনো সার্ভে করি, নাহলে কোনো স্টাডি করি, what we really mean are Indians and Pakistanis, Sri Lankans. বাংলাদেশিরা সংখ্যায় এত কম থাকে ওইসব সার্ভেতে, it's not worth making any kind of generalizations. সেই কারণে আমি যখন এসেছি তখন বাংলাদেশিদেরকে নিয়ে অনেক কম লেখা হতো। ডক্টর নাজলি কিবরিয়া wrote this groundbreaking book for us paved the way for us to begin a conversation like that. Um, তো অনেক সময় প্রথমেই যেটা হোঁচট খেতে হতো সেটা হচ্ছে যে, well, why is it important? খুবই জেনুইন একটা ইন্টেলেকচুয়াল একটা ইম্পর্টেন্ট প্রশ্ন যে, when I say why is your story important, what I mean is that যে আমরা যারা বাংলাদেশী না, আমরা যারা বাংলাদেশ নিয়ে কিছু জানি না, আমরা কানাডায় শুধু চিনি, নাহলে শুধু আমেরিকাকেই চিনি। আমরা কি লার্ন করতে পারি তোমার স্টোরি থেকে, বাংলাদেশের স্টোরি থেকে? সো আমি কিন্তু শুরু করছি সেখান থেকে যে টু থিঙ্ক যে আমি কিরকম ভাবে আমি আমার বইটাকে লিখতে পারি যেটা মেইন স্ট্রিম স্কলারশিপে ছোট একটা মার্ক হলো যাতে করতে পারে, যেটা মেইন স্ট্রিম কনভারসেশনে এন্টার করা, যে সেটা বাংলাদেশি হোক, বাংলাদেশি মুসলমান হোক, শুধু মুসলমান হোক, যে there's something to learn from these voices, even if you are not one of them. So আমার হোপ যেটা আমার বই থেকে সেটা হচ্ছে যে I hope people read my book এবং সেটা থেকে just take what you think is useful for you. অনেক কিছু আছে যেটা আমি লিখতে চেয়েছি আমার বইয়ে যেটা আমি লিখতে পারিনি. So my contribution in the book is to open the door to a new way of thinking about international migration. আমরা এতদিন রিসিভিং কান্ট্রি এবং সেন্ডিং কান্ট্রি নিয়েই কিন্তু চিন্তা করতাম। আমি সেখানে যেটা আনতে চেয়েছি সেটা হচ্ছে যে তুমি হয়তো বা শ্রীলঙ্কা থেকে আমেরিকাতে এসেছো, কিন্তু তোমার কিন্তু বাংলাদেশিদের থেকেও কিন্তু তোমার কিছু একটা শেখার আছে। বাংলাদেশ could be an elsewhere. তুমি বাংলাদেশ থেকে হয়তো বা আমেরিকাতে এসেছো, নাহলে কানাডাতে এসেছো, কিন্তু ওই যে ফার অ্যাওয়ে একটা কান্ট্রি নাইজেরিয়া যেটাকে তুমি চিনো না, কোনো সময় যাওনি, দ্যাট কান্ট্রি কিন্তু তোমার জন্য ইম্পর্ট্যান্ট, রাইট? তো অনেক কিছু আছে যেটা আমি লিখতে পারিনি আমার বইয়ে, বিকজ ইউ ক্যান্ট রাইট অ্যাবাউট এভরিথিং ইন ইয়োর বুক। যেটা হচ্ছে, সো আই হোপ দ্যাট পিপল use that door that I tried to open through my book for their own work, and try to, in whatever way possible, to bring Bangladeshis and South Asians into mainstream scholarship. এটা কিন্তু দুই দিক থেকে মেইন স্ট্রিম স্কলারশিপ তাদেরও ওপেন হতে হবে ফর দিস ভয়েসেস, এবং আমাদের একটা কনসার্টেড এফোর্ট করতে হবে টু স্পিক ইন দ্য ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ দ্যাট দে আর ফ্যামিলিয়ার উইথ। It is only when we do that, তখন কিন্তু it will hopefully come to a stage when we don't have to make the case again and again যে we are a really prominent immigrant group, আমাদের এই conditions, এই experiences, and people will know যে হ্যাঁ, we don't have to start from scratch, we can start from level 5 or level 6. So I hope for the general audience যারা হয়তো বা academic না, যে আমার বইটাকে তারা সেরকম ভাবে দেখে যে it's a genuine effort, যে স্ট্রাগলটা আমার করতে হয়েছিল আমেরিকাতে এসে হয়তো বা আমি চেষ্টা করেছি এটলিস্ট সেই স্ট্রাগলটা থেকে কিছু দূর আগাতে, টু ওপেন আ নিউ ডোর, যেখানে বাংলাদেশ থেকে এখন যে ছাত্রছাত্রীরা আসবে তারা যদি বাংলাদেশি ইমিগ্রেন্ট নিয়ে যদি তাদের পড়াশোনা করতে হয়, তাদের একটা আছে যে এখান থেকে শুরু করা যায়, রাদার দ্যান আমার এখন প্রেজেন্ট করতে হবে কিরকম ভাবে আমি from scratch, যে কিরকম ভাবে আমি প্রেজেন্ট করতে পারি যে আমার রিসার্চ is important, my community is important. So it's a long-winded way of saying that that's how I wish people would see my book.
Thank you so much, Professor Shams, for your time and for your wonderful insights. And obviously, you have identified and said it very clearly, the importance that we exist, we matter, and somebody have some people have to start that conversation. And we're very grateful to you that you started that very critical and important process. Sangeeta, আপনাকে অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ। আপনি আমাদের সাথে আজকে জয়েন করেছেন, and you asked very critical questions. Towards the end, I always enjoy that when I go from a conversation with more questions, if not answer, more questions that make us think. ওয়ান্স এগেন থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ প্রফেসর শামস, সঙ্গীতা এবং আমাদের সাথে যারা ছিলেন। আবারও দেখা হবে। ভালো থাকবেন, সুস্থ থাকবেন। আল্লাহ হাফেজ।